But we appreciate your being here. If you need one of our new music history guides, let us know. We got plenty of them up here. They're free. I always say they're free, but they're very expensive. So just take one or two. But because they're all paid for by grants. And while I'm thinking about that, I should mention the people we have to thank for this. And that includes the Yassine Foundation, the Lost and Family Foundation, for a big help, the Downtown Knoxville Alliance, Visit Knoxville, we work with them a lot, the City of Knoxville, and the great Union Avenue Books, which I'm grateful is just down the street. Yeah, they deserve it. And ordinarily, I would mention Humanities Tennessee and the National Endowment for the Humanities, but you may have read the news about what's going on with that right now, and we're not sure we're getting the money that we were pledged for that as a result of recent developments. So we may need to make up for that in the near future. That they were going to pay for a lot of copies of these. So that's just an issue we have to deal with. A lot of folks are having to deal with similar issues more seriously than we are. But anyway, I'm grateful to be part of this. This has been a lot of fun to work on, and it's a really, I knew some of the story, but put a lot more of it together to make more sense of it. And it is kind of a fascinating American story, the history of music in Knoxville, and it's also the history of music in America to a great degree. But this is we came up with this guide, and it's a companion to our walking literary guide, which came out 2 or 3 years ago, and was a big success. We just reprinted it, so we got a lot of those too. If you haven't gotten one, it has everything: James Agee to Nick Giovanni, Cormac McCarthy, all the people who had dealings with Knoxville, especially downtown Knoxville, and kind of walks you through what they saw and what they wrote about. This guide we knew was going to be more complex than that, and it's in fact it's 8 pages thicker than the literary guide. It has a narrative, a biographical section, and a geographical section, which allows you to make your own walking tour of it as you choose. But I've noticed people always flip to the biographical section first, and that always worries me because they're probably looking for friends of theirs who are musicians, and they are probably not in there. Most of the people in our biographical section are dead, and some of them have been dead for a century or so. But this is a historical guide, and I have a lot of friends who were musicians in the 80s and 90s, and some of them had some degree of national attention at one time or another. So I kind of had to just navigate this as telling people things they may not know about and things they need to know about to understand our history. These are people who were there at turning points and who had an effect on music after them. Often it's hard to assess people who are our contemporaries. Our original draft included about 70 people who were highlighted in the biographical section. I learned early this year that we needed to keep it down to 40 pages to stay within our budget. We had to cut out 8,000 words from our original draft. So we're going to try to put that big draft online sometime soon. But I have some fear that people pick it up and thumb it through and not see their favorite singer-songwriter and dismiss the whole thing as a hack job. But this is a historical guide, and although we try to wrap up with some nods to the 21st century, the shank of the story is the century after the Civil War, from the 1860s to the 1960s, when so many different kinds of new music were proliferating, and including most of the music we know today. So these are not necessarily the best musicians in Knoxville history, but they were the pivotal ones associated with innovation and new forms of music. It's often hard to know who's going to be significant until you can look at them in retrospect. And this is true of some of the people in our guide. People like Roy Acuff, who was kind of an outlier, he was talked about in the 1930s in the newspaper only because he was so weird, and that was what got the attention of newspaper writers like Bert Vincent. He was describing this kind of bizarre show that this guy had and how extremely popular he was. He couldn't quite put a finger on what made him popular. He was funny, he was surprising, he was daring, but they never described his music very much, and that's what we look back to today, and we realize what a major figure in not just country music, but in popular music in general, Roy Acuff was. He appears in rock and roll histories, he appears in, of course, country music histories, but other popular music of all kinds. But also Dolly Parton, 25 years later, did not get the attention in Knoxville that Roy Acuff did in the 30s. I only found one little article about her. She's mentioned once or twice elsewhere. But it was not until many years later, she moved to Nashville in 1964. She performed here for 6 years, moved to Nashville in 1964, and only years later became a legend and considered a genius as a songwriter and a performer. Without the retrospective opinions of music scholars, we have a few presumptions about the music of my generation. This is more work of history than of personal opinion. And I want to thank that this is about the same talk I gave at Big Ears a couple of weeks ago, but with the benefit of video that we didn't have slides at the Big Ears thing. But thanks to my colleague Paul James, who put together this great program. One other some people I need to thank also are Robin Easter and Whitney Sanders, who put together this wonderfully designed book as well. And I always am grateful that they're just around the corner from where we work, and we can pop in and work on projects together with them. Anyway, there are a lot of truisms and misconceptions about Knoxville music, especially in terms of its place in country music history. A lot of people will tell you that Nashville stole country music from us, or that it existed here and not there, and these things are not exactly true. But this is, if not a correction, at least a fresh research-based perspective on how music evolved. And I say music generally, not just country music. Music was always part of Knoxville's history, though in the early days we know very little about what they listened to in those earliest days. And Paul, I guess we can start moving this slide. This is an image of Knoxville as it was known when it was the capital of Tennessee in the 1790s and early 1800s. A very small place. You see the northern edge of it is Clinch Avenue, and this was we're actually out in the northern North Knox County where we are now. But this is what Knoxville looked like when it was a capital, when it was famous. It was a tiny capital. It had just a few hundred people. But it had a newspaper. It had a newspaper before it had a church. But we know a little bit about music from the newspapers, only from little clues like the facts that violins were for sale here by 1798. And we have here's a picture of Knoxville in the mid-19th century. Kind of a fairy tale sort of picture. I always talk about this picture. This is looking from the west side and the vicinity of the UT Hill at the village of Knoxville. Next one, Paul. But this is a very early 1798 ad that points out that there are a large supply of chocolate, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, but also violins. Violins, looking glasses, coffee mills, turkey yarn, whatever that is. But so there was a market of some sort for violins in those early days. And we don't know a whole lot about it, except there's some kind of anecdotal secondhand stories about fiddles being played at dances. But I don't think we had a lot of dances in those days. At least not much mention of it that I've found. But there are one surprising thing is some of the earliest references to violins and violins were the main instrument that people had in those early days, were to escape slave ads. A lot of these people, this is a guy named Simon. This is kind of a poignant. It's about 25 years of age. They're looking for this guy, this escaping slavery. 5 feet 9 or 10 inches, well-formed, remarkably handsome visage, speaks with uncommon softness and modesty, is sensible in conversation, and plays well on the violin. And this is remarkable how many of these escaped slave advertisements talk about how well they played violin or fiddle in those days. I guess there was some expectation either that they would play music for dances, but maybe they just enjoyed it. We don't know very much about that. But there's another one. We have this is a guy named Sam, also 25 years of age, and talks about a scar just in terms of describing him and so forth. It talks about what a good violin player he is as well. So this is here's just a couple from 1810. But that's something we don't have any descriptions of white people being good violin players, and we don't know whether there were any back then. That's an interesting fact. But one rare concert, we don't see many concerts at all, but a rare one is this one from a vocal and instrumental concert. Mr. Richardson, late leader of the band at the circus, Richmond and Mrs. Richardson, a celebrated singer and dancer from Philadelphia, concerts in Richmond Theater on their way to Nashville. I respectfully inform the ladies and gentlemen of Knoxville they will give a concert in Mr. Ray's Hotel. This is one of the earliest concerts, I think the earliest concert I've seen ever described here, and it's important to mention because Ray's Hotel was what we later knew as the Lamar House, which is the front of the Bijou Theater, which had lots and lots of concerts and continues to. So if you go into, you walk into the lobby of the Bijou Theater, you're in Ray's Hotel that had this early concert in 1890, or if you go have supper at the bistro, the same thing. Another kind of surprise is that Knoxville's, some of the first musicians, professional musicians in Knoxville, worked at what was called the Female Academy, which was founded in 1811, and by the 1820s had teachers specializing in music. And this is a woman who may be the first resident professional musician in Knoxville. We don't know her first name. She was Miss Littleford, whom the trustees have lately engaged as a teacher of music. She's been with us for a short time. Her qualifications as an instructress, and we can therefore have no experimental or positive evidence. We will, however, say that in conformity with the solicitations of the trustees, which she performed during the day, several pieces on the piano, which must have convinced every connoisseur that she is perfect mistress of the science she professes. So that's interesting. They also had some recitals, if not concerts. They had recitals of students at the Female Academy. Anyway, there was also some church music. There was we had some music books that were published here. Some of them were in the Sacred Harp or shape note tradition. There was a book called the Knoxville Harmony that came out in 1838, implying that Knoxville had some reputation in this regard, but I have not found any actual descriptions of this kind of music being performed here. So I don't know exactly what that would have meant to people in those days. But we had a few minor sensations, and this is again, the City Hotel is the same thing as Ray's Hotel, which is the same thing as the Lamar House and the Bijou Theater today is. And this is significant. Last night was hard to beat. Old Joe Sweeney is evidently one of them, a perfect star in his line, and his boys will do to take along. I'm not sure what all this jargon means, but if there were any among the large audience that were not delighted with performance last evening, we are sorry for them. Joe as a banjo player is unrivaled. he can beat the man that made him and not half try. Laugh and grow fat is a true saying, and those of our friends who want to try the experiment and enjoy a rare treat should not fail to give Joe a call tonight. Joe Sweeney was Joel Sweeney, who was actually he was not from here, but lived, I think, in North Carolina, was one of the innovators and popularizers of the banjo. They say, some people say that he's the guy that added the fifth string to the banjo, but he was here in Knoxville doing a probably short residency at the City Hotel in 1847. But considered kind of an oddity, I think. There were a lot of these occasional oddities that people on their way somewhere else would stop here and draw a crowd. Another one of those is that of General Tom Thumb, and this is the Tom Thumb that you heard about. He was a dwarf. They call him the celebrated English dwarf. He was not English. He was actually from Connecticut, but he had been in England before this. It got some attention when he met Queen Victoria when he was touring as a small child, a smaller than average child in England, and that might be why they thought he was English. But he proposed to give a grand vocal concert this evening at the courthouse. And that was what he was doing in those days. He was touring America with P.T. Barnum, and was here and got drew some attention while he was here. They say he was a great performer, even at the age of 11, which he was at the time which he was here in Knoxville. Of course, he continued to be a major showman for the rest of his life. Anyway, what do we have next here, Paul? Okay, this is I want to mention that this is a time, late 1840s is the time when a lot of things were changing culturally in America, mainly because of massive waves of immigration. Millions and millions of people, especially from Ireland, people fleeing the famine, they were starving to death, came to the shores of America. And many of them settled in the seacoast cities, but Knoxville happened to be hiring at this time. So we were building railroads here and hiring lots of people from, regardless of where you came from. If you had a strong back and a will to work, you had a job in Knoxville. And a lot of hundreds and hundreds of immigrants came here. Some of them stayed, some of them moved on. But a lot of these immigrants were Germans, and they were fleeing not famine, but political chaos in Central Europe. This is the time of the revolutions of 1848, which were idealistic in their origin and catastrophically a failure in what really happened. And they were oppressed. Things were worse in Germany than they had been before for many people, and many mothers told their kids to go away for your own good. They never see you again, and in many cases they didn't. But a lot of Germans came here, and when they arrived here, they changed American culture. They found that America didn't have a whole lot of culture, so they kind of filled in a lot of gaps. They brought us things that are familiar, like Christmas trees. They brought beer. Thank the German refugees for that. Almost all the mainstream American beers today have the names of refugees who came over in the 1840s and 50s as part of this massive wave of German immigrants. But they also brought music, classical music especially, and not everybody was blessed with getting someone like a guy named Gustavus Canala. Who was from not just anywhere in Germany, he was from Leipzig, kind of the world center of music. And not only was he from Leipzig, he had been a member of Felix Mendelssohn's orchestra. He played the horn, various horns, and came here. And the reason he came to East Tennessee was not necessarily to get a job on the railroad, like a lot of people did. But he came here because we had a refuge for German-speaking people that they called Wartburg. We know it as Wartburg in Morgan County. But that was a German-speaking little community there that was established to kind of receive parts of this wave of German immigrants to America. And a lot of people got there, and it was out in the middle of nowhere. It was cold in the winter. They didn't have anywhere to go. Some people went all the way back to Germany, but some people said, well, maybe Knoxville. Let's give Knoxville a try. And that was Gustavus Canava did that. He actually lived in 2 or 3 towns and cities in East Tennessee before he settled here. Toward the end of the Civil War, he actually joined a Union band, led a Union martial band during the Civil War. But he was in Knoxville by the end of the war, and he was teaching music here. So this guy, this is remarkable. We had this guy from Mendelssohn's Orchestra. He was here teaching music, and he saw a lot more possibilities for Knoxville, potential for Knoxville as a musical place after he'd been here for a little bit, because he was here and began listening to especially female singers in churches, and he kind of went around to the Methodist and Presbyterian churches and kind of Episcopal church, and kind of identifying the best singers in the choir and bringing them together and said, you want to do something else besides on Sunday? And a lot of them were interested in what he was doing. He was proposing something that he called the Knoxville Philharmonic, and this was an organization that he founded in 1867. When we think about a philharmonic today, often you think it's a short for a big symphony orchestra, and he might have dreamed of that. I don't think we ever had anything like a symphony orchestra during this time. And philharmonic means just people who love music, kind of a club of people who love music. And this was something he brought these people together and began having concerts. And they began having operatic concerts, mainly, singing arias from operas. And this is the heyday of Verdi. This is even Rossini was some of the early. Rossini was kind of the very end of Rossini's life. But Rossini's name was well known. Of course, we have the Rossini Festival coming up this coming weekend. It's interesting. I think that's a coincidence that the Knoxville Opera Company began celebrating Rossini. I think it's the only Rossini festival in America. But I think Rossini's the earliest named composer that I see in Knoxville newspapers, even though there was just often and mentions of available sheet music. But a lot of this was 1860s and 70s was really the heyday of Italian and German opera, and a lot of these sopranos from churches began learning to sing in other languages and singing with Gustavus Canava. But anyway, he's became a major figure. He's been almost utterly forgotten, but he was really Knoxville's first impresario, I think we'd say, in any genre of music at all. He was the first guy who really tried to get people together and do something remarkable. But this was there was a lot going on in those days, and it's remarkable. As soon as he started doing this in 1867, other things started popping up, and he began having these programs. We had only a few very small halls. They were like Masonic halls and things like that held maybe 300 or 400 people. The biggest ones, that was it. And Paul, we have the next one. Yeah, this is about this is the first review of it says the Philharmonic Concert, and this is from early '68, and this is an excited description of what's going on at this Philharmonic concert. Don Pasquale is part of the show. What else? It's Martha, an opera that is repeatedly performed here. Trovatore, but these are all things that are mentioned, and this is the first time many people probably had heard of these operas. And I want to emphasize that before this, there were no concerts in Knoxville except for those occasional oddities. That there were not. We may have had something like country music. Some people had a fiddler in the family, and you might have heard, Soulful Joy or something like that now and then. But it wasn't anything that people assembled to listen to. People didn't pay attention to it. It was just in the background if you were at a dance or something like that. So this is the first organized attempt to get people to listen to music. And it's a German guy from Leipzig organizing opera music for Knoxville. And this was, and of course, this was a fascinating time. I consider it, it's like a renaissance in Knoxville, because we had all these waves of interesting immigrants with different cultures, but also we have recently freed African Americans who were forming their own bands. There were actually two rival brass bands, black, we call them colored bands at this time. And this was, they were all part of the scene, part of the sound of Knoxville in the late 1860s, when suddenly everything was breaking open. We had opera, and it was like baseball was like the same day as opera. All these things were happening all at once. Breweries were here suddenly. We had street festivals. We never had street festivals before. It was just a lot of things happening all at once in terms of the arts. And we were just kind of discovering ourselves as a city. And of course, the city was growing pretty fast at this time after the Civil War kind of set it back some. But Turner Hall was one of the opera venues. And Turner Hall, you might assume, was named for someone named Turner. Turner Hall, though, was named for the Turners, who were members of the German Turnverein. And that was a German cultural organization that organized a lot of these operatic concerts. But Turner Hall was over on Main Street opposite the courthouse, meaning the courthouse was on the other side of the street, so this might have been over near where the current courthouse is today. It's just every member a star, but the entertainments can consist of intermittent selections from operas, burlesques, extravaganzas, farces, pantomimes, and Ethiopian minstrelsy. And what that meant at that time. But this was not unlike what you might find. They didn't have full operas, they had arias from operas, and probably a lot like what you'll find at Rossini Festival this weekend. You'll hear a lot of different parts of operas sung by very competent singers, and that's what they had at Turner Hall at that time. But next one. These were all, like I say, very small venues, and this guy changed that pretty radically. Peter Staub was he was from Switzerland, a German-speaking Swiss guy. Had a long backstory. He had actually tried to found a Swiss refugee community over near where Bonnaroo is now, in this place called Grootley. But this was something that it was a terrible failure. He was kind of chased out of town. This utopian dream that was promised to the Swiss was not exactly what he promised. But he came to Knoxville, and we worked hard on kind of reviving his reputation, and did so very well here because he was very popular here. Elected mayor twice, as you see. But the first thing that he was best known for was building an opera house. Our first opera house was built in 1872, and that's it. That's in the Second Empire style. This is a grand European style opera house. It originally held 1,100 people. Later on, I think it was expanded and got a good deal bigger than that. But this was, Staub's Opera House was there for about 80 years. And in the early days, it had a lot of opera, a lot of performances, vocal performances. It's amazing to think all the things that happened in that building over the years. It began very strong. In 1872, it opened, and in the first year, there was a really big show there by a Norwegian violinist. Is that the one we have? This is the opera house. I want to mention this is one of the sopranos that was so impressive to Canava. Sue Boyd Barton, who was a member. She lived in Blunt Mansion in her youth, but she was considered what do they call her? She was just one of the great soprano singers of her time, and this was she was one of the people that really got people interested in music. Let's see what else. There are a few recognizable names in that group. And this Katie Staub, who was kin to Peter Staub, so he might have had a ulterior motive to give his daughter a chance to do some singing in this grand opera house as well. Next one, Paul. And here's another thing going on, the Mozart Club, which was a club of people who love Mozart, obviously. But this was the Mozart Hall, was across the street on Day Street near what's now the Cruise Park Extension. It was where Mozart Hall was. And it was not as big as Staub's Opera House, but it was kind of a multi-purpose venue that had large and small rooms for recitals and small, chamber performances and things like that. But this was, they had just a wide variety of things there at Mozart Hall, and it was run by the Mozart Club. But that article has a mention of interesting Miss Lou Crouch on the piano. And it's interesting that Miss Lou Crouch, she was a sister of Charles Crouch, the painter, and uncle of the other Charles Crouch who donated the park. But she was his aunt. So it's interesting that this place where she was briefly a star in the 1870s is now named for her family. Crouch Park is they're part of this wave of German disaffected Germans who came here. But next one. Okay, this was the beginning of an era. But this is something pretty surprising. If anybody could picture a music festival in Knoxville, Tennessee in the 1880s, you might not imagine this in particular. This started in the early 1880s. Canaba was behind it. This was a big thing intended to popularize music, operatic music especially. But you see, these are major stars. Emma Uke was from Vienna, and she was one of the major singers in the world at the time, and she came to Knoxville to sing at the Knoxville Music Festival. Here you see Italian names: Jules Perotti, Adele Alster-Oy, who worked with Franz Liszt. So she was. These are important singers at the time. Yeah, we need to reset this. But I can talk a long time about the Knoxville Music Festival. Anyway, was just a remarkable thing. People come from many miles around, and it's interesting that there were 3 daily newspapers here at the time, and 2 of them loved the opera festival, thought it was the best thing ever. One of them didn't like it. They said it was called the Knoxville Sentinel. And they said we need factories, not festivals. But one doesn't get in the way of the other, because we built a lot of factories in the 1880s during the time that we were having these festivals. And I think some people, the festivals might have helped bring attention to Knoxville and in the way of factories as well. But this was, they were typically 4 days long, and I'd like to mention that this was about the length of big ears. This is kind of like a precedent to big ears in a way. And they had just a mainly operatic, mainly classical, but a pretty big variety of things within these festivals as they occurred. But they had, among the other people over the years was Victor Herbert, the famous composer, was a featured performer before he was really famous at a Knoxville Music Festival. But these were just remarkable things. They happened mainly at Staub's Opera House, and they were at the height of them were kind of a part of a big thing. They built a larger kind of a street festival around the music festival that was inside Staub's Opera House, in which they would take out have like tournaments at over across the river at Cal Johnson's first racetrack. Cal Johnson, the formerly enslaved guy that later was famous for building his own racetrack in East Knoxville, first leased a racetrack on the south side of the river, and it was exactly where Suttree Landing is today. It was a half-mile oval racetrack over there, a horse racing track that was later used by UT and other things, but it was really established in the early 1880s, the same time as this opera festival was happening. But during the opera festival, they would often have jousting tournaments at Cal Johnson's racetrack. And these young men of the city would get dressed up like knights, and they would go out literally with lances and run, gallop their horses, and not try to knock each other off. I don't think, but they would try to get their lances through hanging rings that would be hanging there to be kind of a show how well they were at using their lances. And then they would have a crowning of a queen of the festival. After that, they had some daily like street fair type shows and things as part of the festival as well. But this was a fascinating chapter in Knoxville's history. But this was all good festivals have a surprise. In 1883, May of 1883, the Knoxville Music Festival had a pretty big surprise. In that, are we back sort of, or but had a big surprise on a Saturday afternoon after most of the sopranos had finished singing. There were still several hundred people in town, and they were assembling at Staub's Opera House, wearing their opera clothes, when they had a bit of a surprise, and it was a bunch of old men got up on stage and began performing with fiddles, and they began. It was not opera at all. It was a fiddling contest. And so we're going to play some tunes we bet you haven't heard since before the war, which suggests that Knoxville might have had some familiarity with fiddle tunes before the Civil War, but had just stopped listening to them. People had stopped doing that, and it was a big hit. And this is remarkable that this would happen at an opera festival. But this may have been in May of 1883, and I've talked to some country music historians. They don't know of an earlier country music concert in history. This may have been the first country music concert in world history, but it was a kind of a prank on an opera festival. So people really loved it, and they talk about afterwards what a great thing this was, and they made fun of it while they loved it, but they said we should keep doing this. It's funny that they thought it was hilarious, but they also thought it was something valuable enough to keep doing. And that was, and you see mentions of Arkansas Traveler and a lot of these, Bart Giffen. Some of these people were later well known as fiddlers in the area. By the way, Arkansas Traveler is a tune that when Ole Bull, the great Norwegian violinist, came, he was one of the biggest big international stars to perform in Knoxville, and he did that right a few months after Staub's Opera House opened, and he played an entirely classical series of songs repertory, and then finished with the surprise for the audience, and that was Arkansas Traveler, and he'd been playing entirely with Italian sopranos and tenors accompanying him, but that was the crowd just loved it, and that was a big surprise, and so was this fiddling contest in May of '83. But anyway, this was really a height of a lot of things in the 1880s. A great deal of interest in all this. But this was, and again, this was further encouraged by, we had a very popular guy in town who was both a very successful politician, but also a kind of a motivational speaker. When Governor Taylor was in town, Robert Love Taylor was in town, people would come out and they would sell out Staub's Opera House. He would give these kind of very funny but also kind of thrilling and heartening speeches to people who were needing some encouragement one way or another. But he ran for governor of Tennessee against his own brother in 1886. Taylor was a Democrat, Alf was a Republican. And they ran against each other. They were both fiddlers, and they say that sometimes instead of debating on stage, they would just play fiddle against each other. But he was a big, here he is, he was a big proponent of the fiddle and wrote his most famous piece of writing is called The Fiddle and the Bow. And he talks about music as being the most exalted of all art forms. And was very popular here. He was governor in Nashville for several years. Then after that, he moved back to Knoxville. And if you live in 4th and Gill, you'll probably hear people talk about the old governor's mansion that was there. And that it wasn't really the governor's mansion, but it was where it was a mansion, but it was where he lived when he came back to town later on. By the way, he was the grandfather of the Pulitzer-winning novelist Peter Taylor, whose last novel was partly about him, and also the great uncle of Ann Taylor of NPR fame. So, and a lot of Taylors are kind of famous in history. But anyway, with all these people, these fiddling contests, even though the classical music thing didn't die, the fiddling contests kept going. Not just yearly, they were often several times a year, and often on Market Square. It had moved into a more public place where you didn't have to buy a ticket to hear the fiddling contest. But meanwhile, there are also street musicians here and there, like especially around the train station, Charlie Oakes and George Renaud. We found this, actually, Eric Dawson, I think, connected us to this piece, and Eric Dawson's going to be saying a few words after a little bit from a phone collection. This is a great, I wish more people took just street pictures like this, but these are a man and his wife, both blind and carrying tin cups. He's playing guitar, and just hoping for and singing and hoping for some nickels in his cup. I don't know whether this it could possibly be George Renaud and his wife, who was later a recording artist. But this is possible. But this is circa 1930. But there were street musicians here by the 1870s and 80s. And they were at Market Square especially, but also on the train stations, where there'd be a lot of fresh crowds all the time. One of the best known of them was a guy named Charlie Oakes, who was playing at the Southern Station by 1880s and 90s, and he was blind too. It seems as if almost all of these early street musicians were blind or disabled in one way or another, because no one who was able to do something else would be willing to play music for nickels in the street, and that's what they did. But he began writing his own songs. Charlie Oakes did, and began this before recording. He began selling them in lyric form. He would get the lyrics, someone to print up lyrics for him, and he would sell these lyrics for a nickel to passersby. And he began writing about things he knew about, and those were things about train disasters and things like this. One of his best known songs from this time was about the Newmarket train wreck, 1904. And he wasn't the only one to write a song about that catastrophic train wreck that killed somewhere between 70 and 120 people, depending on what estimates you read. It was just a horrible thing for the people who died, but also the people who survived. It was a extremely traumatic event, just to have lived through that horror. But he describes it in surprisingly frank detail and gory detail in this early song that we know by its lyrics, but not by its tune. We don't know what tune he used. We just have the lyrics were recorded, but not the tune. But later on, George Renaud, who was a generation younger, did record his own version of a song called "The Southern Railway Wreck." But he also wrote about tragedies, about death of various kinds, and was things that he heard about at the train station. And these were some of the first musicians. In fact, some people have called Charlie Oakes the first professional country musician in history, the first one who actually made a living as a country musician. So this was very different from the Governor Taylor and his friends. These were street people. Anyway, meanwhile, there were other things going on, more in the line with what Gustavus Canava would have recognized, and that had a lot to do with a woman named Bertha Walburn Clark, a really remarkable woman who came here from Cincinnati. She was conservatory trained, came from kind of the German community in Cincinnati. In 1902, arrived in Knoxville and was first performing violin and teaching violin. She became well known pretty quickly as the best violinist in Knoxville. And by 1910 or so, she was putting together small groups, quartets especially, that would play in the hotels, like the Acton Hotel and later the Farragut Hotel. And here she is at the Farragut. I'm sorry, this room doesn't exactly exist anymore. In the hotel is now known as Hyatt Place. But this was the ballroom at the Farragut Hotel. And this is Bertha Wahlberg Clark. They're in the white on the left, and her little symphony, mostly probably 2/3 women. I don't know, maybe half and half. That original little symphony of about 20 performers that would play and got some attention there. She called that the Little Symphony, and later built it into something much bigger. She's the mother of the Knoxville Symphony Orchestra, and she's one, which is one of the very few orchestras in world history that was founded by a woman and also conducted by a woman in its early days. She was later conductor of the symphony for about 12 years. But an amazing woman whose name I think all Knoxvillians should know. Next one, please, Paul. And here's, I want to mention during the time not long after she arrived here, and I would love to think that she overlapped with Canava. I haven't found a record of them collaborating. Canava died, the German who came over in the 1840s, died in 1906. And about 4 years after Bertha Clark arrived, and to make this connection complete, I really want to prove that they knew each other at least. But it was during this time that the Bijou Theater was built, and I don't think they really knew at the time that in the future it would be more famous than it was in 1909 as one of the most acoustically perfect theaters in America, according to Ben Ratliff from the New York Times, who came here for the first few Big Ears festivals, and was just really astonished at the sound of the Bijou Theater. It was built in 1909. It's built for black and white audiences. Black people sat in the second balcony, and they were there at opening night when they had a Broadway show called Little Johnny Jones, which was, you may not recognize the name of the song, but is the name of the show. But it was a show that brought us Give My Regards to Broadway, and also Yankee Doodle Dandy. That was the very first night that Bijou was open. They had a packed house, everybody wearing tuxedos and fine dresses, and it was but they had that. They also had vaudeville and all sorts of other things. About 15 years after that very first show, they had the first all-black cast, all-black written opera in history, Shuffle Along from New York, which had opened in about 2 years earlier, went on the road and played at the Bijou, and they opened up more of the theater to black audiences because they were just trying to sell seats. And that's part of the theater's history as well. So many great singers have been there over the years, and great musicians, including the Marx Brothers, when they were considered musicians mainly. And Harpo Marx, they say, was the star playing his harp in clowning while he was doing so in 1913 when they first performed there. So we're working on a couple of projects about the history of the Bijou Theater. There are a couple of books worth of stories in the 115, 16-year-old history of that pretty impressive place, which again is the same place. What we've seen here is the same place where that first concert in 1819 was. That guy from Philadelphia who came through. But it's there's not a more musical building in East Tennessee certainly. But anyway. What do we have next here? Yeah, okay. This is the business story. Business is a big part of this story and how businesses changed music. Sturkey Brothers Furniture began in the 1890s. The Sturkeys were sons of Swiss immigrants. They came here in the 1890s, where they started their furniture store in the 1890s. And you wouldn't think of a furniture store as being connected to music, and especially music production. But Sturkey Brothers Furniture they sold phonographs. That's the only place you could get a phonograph was in a furniture store. They were considered furniture, something that looked like fine furniture. But this was, they sold phonographs, and Mr. Sturkey was kind of concerned by 1920 that his phonographs had gotten a lot cheaper, but the working people were not buying them. They thought, why aren't working people buying phonographs? And people said, well, maybe they don't like the music you can play on a phonograph. Because at that time, 1920, most of the music that had been produced for phonographs was opera music, some religious music, some other things, marching music and things like that. They didn't have anything that was really spoke to working people. And he began picking up street musicians in the streets of downtown Knoxville and sending them to New York in 1924, which was the nearest studio for recording music. Was in New York, and this was he started picking up people like George Renault, like Charlie Oakes, and Mac and Bob, a blind duo from Kentucky, who were playing in the streets here as well, and sent them to New York, and they made records, and they did fairly well. George Renault was probably the most popular of them. He was a guy, literally a street musician, who played best known for playing out by the post office where the Weather Bureau stand was. But he's the guy, among other things, who first recorded the song On Top of Old Smoky. And this was in 1925, the same year that everybody was excited about the Smoky Mountains National Park, and the same year that we changed our baseball team name to the Smokies. This was all happening at the same time, and I think it was not a coincidence that people were suddenly preoccupied with the Smokies and Old Smoky and so forth. But he had a moment in the sun for 2 or 3 years. He had some national following, and again, this is before the Bristol sessions. The Bristol sessions were very important, or more important in many ways than these things were. But this is before that. This was the Bristol sessions that had Jimmy Rogers and the Carter family a few years later. But this was, but he did have a following in among record buyers in the mid 1920s. The sad thing about him is he had a following, then it was over. It was like one of many short-lived 1920s fads. It just didn't last very long. And he actually came back to Knoxville and was playing in the streets again in his later years. And he eventually died of tuberculosis at the age of 38. Just after still playing in the streets after all these years. They say that radio killed him, that his friends blamed radio for it. And of course, radio exalted some people. But Mac and Bob, including Mac and Bob, went to Chicago and made a living in radio. And Uncle Dave Macon was not from here. He was from Middle Tennessee, and this is kind of an interesting switch because we think of East Tennesseans going to Middle Tennessee to be on the radio. Uncle Dave Macon did the opposite thing. He came here to perform in Knoxville because he was connected to Sturkey Brothers Furniture, and they produced his early records. Uncle Dave Macon, of course, later became one of the first star of the Grand Ole Opry. Next one, please. And WNOX started this, and Sturkey Brothers got interested in radio, and they began sponsoring radio stations and radio station shows. WNOX was one of our first radio stations, was fully fledged by 1925. In the early days, they had all kinds of music. They played anything live. They didn't play records on the radio much. It was always come to the studio and play live. And they had classical music, they had religious music, they had blues, they had various kinds of music. They became more and more known for country music as the years went on. But that was WNOX. You might recognize vaguely that facade, which is still sort of there. That's the gap in 100 block of A Street, and that facade, only the facade, the brick facade, is still there today. But that was where WNOX studios were from 1936 to 1955 when they moved up to Whittle Springs, and that's where it kind of died out. The live radio era was dead by that time. Anyway, this was they had a daily show there for a long time, the midday merry-go-round. And this was, here's the Knoxville Sessions, which were all recorded 1929, 1930 at the St. James Hotel. This was an attempt by Sturkey and other folks to try something new. By this time, the Bristol Sessions already happened, the Johnson City Sessions. They wanted to try Vocalion, a different major record company, wanted to try something different in Knoxville. And they came to the St. James Hotel, and they found a lot of different performers here, not just country. Probably 40 to 50% of what they found at the St. James Hotel was some form of country music, but a lot of it was not. And here's some of the early ones, the Tennessee Chocolate Drops. These are them as older men. I'm sorry we don't have a good picture of them as young men. But Howard Armstrong was known as Louie Bluey, and Carl Martin were the two original members of the Tennessee Chocolate Drops. The later Carolina Chocolate Drops kind of paid homage to with their name. But they were performing on the street in Knoxville in the 1920s, and took this opportunity to make their only known recordings at the St. James Hotel during this period of sessions in 1929 and 1930. And went on and they later got together as Martin, Bogan, and Armstrong in the 1960s and 70s. And were very popular on college campuses then. But they were really jazz for strings. It was not country music. It was really a kind of a jazz style of music. If you think about this in context, this is before Django Reinhardt was doing something similar. I would love to think that their recordings might have made over the pond and gotten the attention of Django Reinhardt. I think that's unlikely. This was right before this time when you had jazz was mainly for horns, but there were a few small combos who were doing fiddle and mandolin and guitar versions of jazz, and I think that we can say the Tennessee Chocolate Drops were doing that. Next one, I think we have some. Yeah, here's Leola Manning, who was a blues singer who sang mainly religious music, but she had this really affecting voice. I first heard of her from this country radical country star Steve Earle, who had heard her music in Europe, and they found some of these old records made at the St. James Hotel, and he wanted to find out all he could about Leola Manning, and I just didn't know that much about her, we've learned a lot about her since then, and her only known recordings again were made at the St. James Hotel. Her family did not know. She lived a long life. She died in the 1990s. Never told her family about these records that they were made. And she became famous not long after her death in 1996, I think it was. A lot of her songs began showing up on CD compilations of kind of obscure blues. In an interesting way. Next one, please. And we wouldn't know about these if not for these sessions. And here's this kind of our early big band, Maynard Baird's Southland Serenaders. Maynard Baird was a movie theater projectionist by day, but led this really smooth dance jazz band at night, and got some currency up the north. He toured the north a few times, was on the radio a lot. Interestingly, in the late 1920s, WNOX didn't have as big a reach as some stations like WSM did, but you could hear WNOX at night from New Jersey, and some people would tune into New Jersey to WNOX and write letters to WNOX about how much they liked the show last night, and often it was Maynard Baird during the show. So there's a lot of jazz, a whole lot of jazz. Jazz really ruled in Knoxville in the 1920s and early 30s especially. But they were a very popular band, often played in movie theaters and all sorts of contexts. Next one, please. And here's a guy that changed a lot of things for a lot of music. Roy Acuff was not, I don't think he considered himself good enough to have tried out for the St. James sessions in 1929-30. He was a lot of trouble as a young man. He was mainly known as an athlete at Central High School. He graduated kind of late. He was 20 when he graduated. I think he would have been happy to stay in high school his whole life because he was a champion in high school. He was a star football, basketball, and baseball player. They talk about how scary he was on the football field and on the basketball court because he was so aggressive. He would just get out of his way and let him have his goal no matter what. But he was a tough guy, and of course he graduated high school, and like a lot of people who graduate high school as athletic champions, they don't know what to do next. Well, he got in trouble. That's what he did. He did try out for. He played for some industrial league baseball teams, and was actually they really wanted to play for the New York Yankees, but they began having a series of heat strokes that kind of ended his baseball career. You have to stand out in the sun to play baseball. And he said, "What am I going to do? I can't do anything now." And he got involved in crime, small time crime. He was involved in bootlegging. He was involved in gambling. He got arrested for assault a couple times, which is not surprising. He got shot once, and this is something that's not in any of his biographies. He was admitted into St. Mary's Hospital with gunshot wounds received at a bad bootlegging deal gone wrong in Fountain City. But he began playing. He came from a musical family. He'd never taken music very seriously, but began working with a mechanic in Fountain City who had some vaudeville experience, and he had some ideas about stage presence and how to present yourself, and also about violin fiddle technique. And he taught really Roy Acuff how to play fiddle and how to play for an audience. And Roy started playing for audiences. His first show ever was at a talent show at the Tennessee Theater in 1932. That he came in second, but in his autobiography he says that just shows you what great musicians there were in Knoxville in those days. His band was called, by the way, the Three Rolling Stones, but his later band was called the Crazy Tennesseans, which was a variable band with that. Sometimes had lots of, sometimes as many as 14 people on stage. Sometimes had women involved. It was just this crazy, unpredictable band that had stunts, it had sound effects, all kinds of stuff that would entertain people who didn't even like music. They were just to come hear this bizarre thing. I compared his arrival in Knoxville circa 1935 to punk rock. And he was unlike anything else he'd ever seen on stage. He didn't always wear a coat and tie as all performers did at the time. But this is one of the several articulations of the Crazy Tennesseans. The guy on the left, by the way, is a guy named Kelsea, who introduced an instrument that most people never heard before, and you see it right here. It's called a dobro. This was a Hawaiian-derived instrument invented by Hungarian immigrants in the Bay Area of California, but it had never taken off. They were trying to capitalize on the Hawaiian music craze in the 1920s that brought us the ukulele and all that. But this was, nobody had ever really done much with it. But Kelsea got really good at it, and he came to Knoxville and had his own band in the early 1930s, started getting attention, and Roy Acuff heard the band in a drugstore on Broadway. They used to play almost anywhere, and he said, "How about you join my band, and we can do something together?" And they did, and this got a lot of attention. He began playing, Roy began playing his version of what had been a street musician's song, street busker's song, evangelical busker's song called "The Great Speckled Bird." And this was a song they started playing here. They went to Chicago and recorded a copy of it. Again, this is long before Nashville had a recording studio, but they went to Chicago, recorded this, and it took off nationally. 1938, and to imagine America in 1938, all the pop music on the radio were the big bands, the Glenn Millers, Duke Ellington, the Dorsey brothers, all these folks. They were smooth jazz, well practiced, beautiful jazz, and to hear this little combo, this string combo, suddenly burst out with this bizarre sound and this kind of aggressive sort of presentation was astonishing. That they became more popular than all these other big bands were for a while. And this was something, and Nashville got interested in this. And this was the Grand Ole Opry had existed for some years, but was not all that well known. WSM had this giant radio tower, much bigger than anything in Knoxville. They could reach from Chicago to New Orleans, all over the middle part of the nation. So when they called Roy Acuff, said, we'd like you to perform on WSM, let's do it. He very quickly agreed. And Roy Acuff went to Nashville and changed Nashville. I think he, more than any other single person, invented the music city as we know it today. But he went there mainly just for the radio station. It was the reason he came back and played in Knoxville again in later years. But it's just remarkable. You really have to read old newspapers to see what a shocking thing was, because a lot of people remember remember Roy Acuff as the funny old guy with the yo-yo, and I think he ran as a Republican for governor once and things like that. He was a kingpin of became a very wealthy man as an executive in Nashville. But what he was doing in his 30s, in the 1930s, is remarkable. Next one. All right, here's when Roy Acuff quit WNOX and went to WROL, WNOX kind of panicked because Roy Acuff had been bringing in the crowds. Roy Acuff, when WNOX was in the Andrew Johnson Hotel, they were evicted because the crowds were so big that when Roy Acuff was there, that they were crowding the elevators. And then they moved into I love this another business story. They moved a couple places and then ended up at the city-sponsored Market Hall, Market Square, and we're bringing in these giant crowds, mainly of boys and young men. And again, it's kind of like punk rock in a way. That women weren't that interested in Roy Acuff in the 1930s, but this was. But they were so big that the movie theaters, who were used to bringing in boys and young men to their cowboy serials on Saturday afternoons, complained to the city about this. That you're subsidizing our competition. This is not fair. And but by this time, Roy was about to move on anyway. But he was so popular that WNOX kind of panicked and said, "What are we going to do without Roy Acuff?" And they said they hired a guy from Chicago, Lowell Blanchard, who worked in country music shows up in Chicago, and had some ideas about presentation of music. And he started in 1936, something called the Midday Merry-Go-Round. Merry-Go-Round is a phrase you see a lot in a lot of contexts in the 1930s. It seems an odd thing today. But anyway, he came here and really hired a lot of different performers from different parts of the country. Some of them from as far away as Milwaukee. Pee Wee King, whose name was Kaczynski. He was born he came out of the Polish dance tradition thing, but he came down here and began playing on Midday Merry-Go-Round. So did Archie Campbell from Bulls Gap, Tennessee. Also Arthur Q. Smith became famous later on as a songwriter. Became famous mainly after his death. But these were the kind of people he brought in. But also a guy from Union County, a teenager from Union County named Chet Atkins. And he came here first, as you see him on the right. When he was on WNOX, he was playing the fiddle. Chet Atkins was a fiddle player when he first got here, but he started listening to the guitar. And again, a lot of the early country stars were secret jazz fans, and Chet Atkins was one of those. If I could run that secret about it, he always considered himself a jazz guitarist rather than a country guitarist. But Chet Atkins began listening to Django Reinhardt, which he was introduced to by some guys backstage at WNOX at the Midday Merry-Go-Round, and he really wanted to sound like this guy out of France. Django Reinhardt and Seven Grappelli and all this, the hot club of France, which is kind of taking the world by storm. All these people paying close attention to music, and he wanted to sound like Django Reinhardt. He said he had other influences as well, but he said in his autobiography that people always talk about his style of guitar playing. He always said my style is me failing to sound like Django Reinhardt. That's what he said. But he became well known here in the early 1940s. Came back several years later with the members of the Carter family, the Carter sisters, and was working with them also in Knoxville in the late 40s, early 50s, and then went on from there. Of course, went to Nashville and left his own mark on Nashville, kind of trying to move country music into a more pop or jazz direction. Next one, please. Paul. Next line. This was the same time as something else was going on, and it's amazing to think of all these things layering on top of each other. Because the Midday Merry-Go-Round opened a few weeks after the first concert of the Knoxville Symphony Orchestra in 1935, when Bertha Walton Clark had actually assembled a full orchestra. But at the same time, the black community had its own things going on, and Swan Silvertones was a big part of the 1940s. So the Silvertones were a band originally from West Virginia who had come down here and were hired hired by the Swan Bakery, which is still, the building's still standing. I'm glad to say, on Magnolia, beautiful old 1920s building, still there. But they were this kind of a gospel harmony group who came here, and they were not on WNOX or WROL, they were on WPR in the early days. But they came here, the leader of Swan Silvertones is the second guy from the left. His name is Claude Jeter. He just had this unreal, otherworldly, beautiful, high voice. And the harmonies of the Silvertones have never really been matched. And they've been a big influence on a lot of people in their own time, but also, surprisingly, a whole lot of rock and roll stars in the 1960s discovered Swan Silvertones, like at the Monterey Pops Festival or something. We're passing around these records, and people started picking this up. Even though these 20-year-old records by Swan Silvertones, actually Paul Simon was one of the first to notice them, and he said they were one of the biggest influences on his songwriter. He says he wrote Bridge Over Troubled Water as inspired by one of Swan Silvertones' songs. But also, even surprisingly, and I'm not sure I can see the connections here, John Fogerty creates other revivals, and he admired them and listened to them while he was composing as well as Bob Weir of the Grateful Dead. And I can't do some more listening to make these connections, but they all really, this was kind of a cult, they had kind of a cult following in the counterculture of the 1960s. These guys who were really a gospel band, and they were still, some of them were still around, including Claude Jeter, and were actually performed with some of these folks. I think Claude Jeter worked with Paul Simon some later in his career, but they were here for 6-7 years in the 1940s. But next one, please, Paul. All right, during the same period, again, this is all overlapping. We have the KSO is fairly new. We got the Midday Merry-Go-Round still going on. Swan Silvertones got other things happening as well. But UT got into the music scene for the first time, really. And after World War II, UT was expanding rapidly. They wanted to become a major university with everything that a major university implies. And they hired a composer from Indiana named David Van Vactor, who was a very modernist composer. He was becoming well known in the 1930s in New York for his very modern styles. They hired him to be director of the music program at UT. And also KSO hired him to be, by this time, Bertha Walmer Clark had retired and was still playing on stage, but had enough of conducting. She was an older woman at this time. They hired him to be the conductor of the KSO. He was the longest ever conductor of the KSO for 25 years, but had an influence on lots of people over the years, including the Trifall brothers. And they were grateful that Eric Dawson, who's going to be speaking in a minute or two, kind of let me know about the Trifall brothers. I'd seen at least one of them before performing. And I didn't know how significant they were. But Gilbert especially was kind of introduced the idea of popular electronic music to the world. What we now call electronica is something he was doing in the late 60s, early 70s, and even trying out, demonstrating it some at UT. But this, there are a couple of very interesting guys that kind of came up under the tutelage of David Van Vactor. But also Edgar Meyer, the great bass player, who was actually at Vineyards this last weekend. But it's remarkable how much crossover there is. And some of this was going on back in the 1930s when Harry Nidus, a guy also from Cincinnati, was the first violinist for the KSO, but he also played fiddle on country bands and Midday Merry-Go-Round. So these were not isolated genres. Next one, Paul. Okay, and during the same time, 1940s basically, Brownie and Stig McGee, several brother acts started showing up. There's the Trifall brothers and Brownie and Stig McGee. They were both born in Mechanicsville. Brownie McGee became much more famous by name. In fact, even had a Hollywood career in time to come, and was Woody Guthrie's early accompanist in the 1940s. But Stick McGee was the guy that people remember who was studying the origins of rock and roll. These guys, the two brothers played together a good deal in their early life. They were born in Knoxville, grew up mostly in Kingsport. They both came back to Knoxville in different ways. Stick McGee lived here for several years until he was drafted into the Army during World War II, 1942, I think. But in the Army, he learned this Army song, which is too gamey to profane, frankly, to actually record. So he changed the words in it. He called it "Drinking Wine Spodioti." And this was his version of this Army song he learned in the South Pacific. That he made this a couple of different versions of it. One 1947 didn't go anywhere. But one he did in 1949, it was called kind of jump blues at the time. Some people look back at his 1949 recording of Drinking Wine Spodioti as the first rock and roll song. There are 3 or 4 claimants to that title, but of course it was later recorded by Jerry Lee Lewis and all other people. But he was the first one, and he was the guy that put the song together. He had a very tragically short life. He had lung cancer in his early 40s, so he kind of faded from the perception. But Browning, he was still around into the 90s and was very much an outgoing guy. He was, like I say, he was in Hollywood. He was even in a Steve Martin movie, The Jerk. It was also Angel Heart. He had a kind of a bizarre speaking role in that movie. But interesting pair of guys. Next one, please. But back to business, and the role of business plays over and over is pretty fascinating. Sam Morrison was a guy from a son of Jewish Eastern European heritage. Had a record store on Market Square, and he was known for selling race records, African American records, and blues and R&B and that sort of thing in the 1940s and 50s. He ran across a phenomenon without expecting it in the summer of 1954 when he got this record from Memphis called "That's All Right, Mom" from Sun Records in Memphis. He began playing it. He had this marketing strategy of playing records on speakers outside of his store. His store was over near where Preservation Pub is, by the way. He began playing this record outside, and people would come. He said people of all ages, all races would come in and say, "What is that music? That sounds great. Give me a copy." And "That's All Right, Mama," for whatever reason, it just kind of flipped a switch in a lot of people's minds. And this happened to be going on. He claimed to have sold more than 1,000 copies of this record out of that one little store in that summer of 1954. And it just so happened that an RCA scout was in town looking for live talent mainly, but he also was always interested in Sam Morrison's store and what was selling there. And he went by there and said, "You won't believe what happens when I do this. Watch when I put this platter on and see what happens." And people flooded into the store to learn more about it and to get a copy. And this guy from RCA bought a copy for himself and a copy for the president of RCA. And they started working on trying to get Elvis Presley to perform for them on record. Ironically, Elvis, I don't think ever played in Knoxville before the jumpsuit era in the 1970s, but this was, according to Elvis biographies, this is when RCA discovered Elvis and when kind of began that track, whether it was good for him or not. That was the way it happened. But interesting business story. Next one, Paul. And here, speaking of interesting business stories, here's Mr. Daz Walker. But he was a grocer who arrived from Sevier County, arrived here in the 1920s. I won't go in really deeply. We have a whole book that our friend Ernie Greenberg had a lot to do with putting together. It's here if you want to learn more about Daz Walker. But he was a our longest term city councilman in history, often the sole no vote and an otherwise unanimous city council. Kind of spoke his mind, but we remember him best as I think in retrospect, as a music impresario. He was on WROL in the early days against Lowell Blanchard. He was the competition to Lowell Blanchard, and was interested in bluegrass in the 1940s. I haven't mentioned the role that also played in bluegrass. But Flatt and Scruggs, when they quit Bill Monroe's band, they came over to WROL when Kaz Walker was there, and I'm not sure if Kaz Walker was the reason they came, but they were performing on WROL and made their very first records at the WROL studio, which was then the Holston building on Bay Street. But Kaz Walker was kind of a mover and shaker. A lot of people make claims about him as being responsible for the whole country music phenomenon. I don't think that's true, but there's one claim that is hard to deny, and we'll mention that later. But I want to mention him first because he hired a family from Iowa. Actually, they were originally from Kentucky. They'd been working a lot as a family act in Iowa for some years before they moved to Knoxville in 1950, early 1953, and they were the Everleys. That one next, yeah, there we go. That's the original Everly family on WROL when they were still a family act, and this was probably taken at the top of the Mechanics Bank building on Gay Street. That's where the WROL Studios was in the early 1950s. But they were, that's their dad with them. He was a fine guitarist himself, Ike Everly, but he was a good friend of Chet Atkins. They really admired each other. But the brothers, they were singing in this family kind of gospel act for some time. It was not as successful in Knoxville as they expected to be. And the brothers began playing off to themselves, and they were wandering down Cumberland Avenue, where their dad had a barber shop on Cumberland Avenue. Their dad quit guitar and became a barber, and he had a barber shop on Cumberland Avenue, and the kids were visiting him, and they were wandering around and walked into Dugout Doug's record store, which was up at the top of the hill near 17th Street, and Dugout Doug would sell almost anything. He sold really gamey, like the Red Fox records, back when Red Fox was controversial, but also they had Bo Diddley in there. In 1955, they got this Bo Diddley record, and they were crazy about it. They played over and over. And they said, what if we did something like this? And they started trying to play guitar like Bo Diddley, but kept singing in their gospel-style harmonies, and added that to rock and roll. And that was extremely successful. And they actually, in Knoxville, they only lived here for less than 3 years, but during this time they began playing as a duo for the first time. They discovered rock and roll for the first time, and they met Chet Atkins here. And Chet Atkins said, well, let's go to Nashville and make some records. And that was the beginning of a major rock and roll phenomenon. But this was really something, and you can see, if you haven't been to Everly Brothers Park in Bearden, you'll get the impression of the influence of the Everly Brothers, because you go in there and you say, gosh, here's a quote from Paul McCartney, and here's a quote from Paul Simon, and here's a quote from Brian Wilson, here's a quote from Mick Jagger. These are all people who all were influenced by the Everly Brothers, and they wrote those things just for this park in Knoxville to express their homage to the Everly Brothers and what they did to music and to their careers. Paul McCartney said that in the early days the Beatles were just him and Paul trying to sound like Phil and Don Everly. Next one, please. And about the same time as Don Gibson, a guy who also was playing with, as a country musician, and a songwriter, but he was also playing with jazz and pop music as well as in rockabilly at the same time. Rock and roll. Anyway, long kind of tragic story of his one of the most successful songwriters ever, but he had very serious personal problems. Next one, please. And here's where I'm going to finish my part of the story. I mentioned Kaz Walker did have a big influence on a performer, and this is the one. And Dolly Parton thinks Kaz Walker hung the sun and the moon. That he's the guy that started her career by giving her a place on the radio. And she began performing live as a 12-year-old kid on WIVK when Kaz Walker had a show there. And this was just down the street on Gay Street, across from Hotchkiss, where that happened. The building's still there. It's been empty for a long time. But on the second floor of this yellow building there is where Dolly Parton began performing as a kid. And she performed, by her own estimation, if you read her autobiography, about 300 times in Knoxville on the radio, or on TV, but was mentioned in the paper only once during that time. People just didn't. She had a fan base that would go see her in the studio, but people just weren't listening to the radio at the right time or whatever. She didn't cause a phenomenon until later. But she was beginning to write songs too at the same time. She lived in Sevier County, Kaz Walker's home county, this whole time. She never spent a night in Knoxville during this time. Her uncle always brought her into the studio and would drive her right back home every night. So she was not like Flat and Scruggs, who actually moved here. She was just always visiting. But she really did begin her career, certainly in broadcasting anyway, in downtown Knoxville. Anyway, this is that's. I have a hard time talking about the last 60 years, partly because I remember a lot of it, and I have a lot of friends who are musicians, and who would be offended if I didn't make a big deal of their careers, I think. But they're a lot of them deserve it. But there are a lot of really great musicians that have come up in the last 60 years. But also, it's more fragmented. It's harder for me to tell a linear story as it is to talk about, as I might see the story that begins with German refugees and moving up to rock and roll. That is a linear story, but it kind of comes apart in my mind at least. So I'm grateful to have a guy that helped us a lot with this booklet, Mr. Eric Dawson. I first knew Eric Dawson's name when he worked for a rival publication. I worked for Metropulse. He worked for something called the Knoxville Voice. And a lot of people thought Metropulse was communist, but Knoxville Voice was even to the left of Metropulse. But we weren't impressed with everything in the Knoxville Voice, but there was a really good music writer in the Knoxville Voice. And I would never guess that Eric Dawson, who I knew by name for a couple of years before I knew him in person, would ever be the head of the McClung Collection, as he is now. But Eric, is he Eric Dawson.
Thank you, Jack, for those kind words. I never would have guessed it either. And yeah, we were to the left of Stalin maybe at the Knoxville Voice sometimes. And thank you, Jack, for bringing me up to risk offending people you don't want to. But I don't have slides, and don't worry, I'm not going to try to cover 60 years in 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever. Although, come to think of it, that might be a good part 2 to this that I'll consider. What I do want to do, just briefly, just take a few minutes to convince you of the importance of the history of punk rock in Knoxville and how it changed the landscape and allowed for things that are happening now. To do that, again, I'll be brief, but you do kind of have to go back to the history of pre-recorded music to understand punk rock, because as Jack was explaining, before then you had concerts such as opera, you had some concerts of classical music, and it wasn't until Sturkey Brothers and other people started making records and selling these 78 RPM records that people heard their friends and neighbors and their communities represented on these recorded discs that would sell throughout the country, if not the world. And so for the first time you had amateur musicians, people who did not play music professionally for a living, making records and disseminating them. Radio comes along, and you start having popular radio shows like the Midday Merry-Go-Round. And while you did have Chet Atkins and Archie Campbell and a lot of people who were very famous and go on to become more famous, a lot of the guys, and they were mostly guys, but there were some women, who played on these shows were not professional musicians. They had day jobs. You can look them up in the directories, city directories, and it will tell their profession. But they were decent enough musicians where they could get on the radio. And so the radio show reigned supreme for a while. But then television came along. And as we all know, television killed the radio star. And also, rock and roll came along. And so country music wasn't quite as popular. Rock and roll, arguably, the bar for playing it, musicianship is a little bit lower than country music, jazz, other types of music. So suddenly what you see is a lot of working class people, a lot of people with day jobs, playing in these rock and roll bands, cutting records. And if you look at old newspapers from the 60s, you start seeing a proliferation of nightclubs and bars and these places where these bands that are long forgotten, I try to hunt a lot of them down whenever I can, but these bands that are sort of not professional there's just dozens of clubs where people are coming to party, to dance, the return of social music, if you will. Before recorded music and concerts, you had what was sort of thought of as social music. Silly kind of term because most music is social, but this is primarily music like dance music, religious music, music that was created within communities by the communities. So the community members were creating music for who was in front of them, for the audience that was there. And you see a lot of this happening even more in the post-war economy. People had more spending money, there were more opportunities, and again, something like rock and roll allowed for these bands to do this. And then along the 70s, punk rock happens. And if the bar for musicianship was lowered during rock and roll, it was pretty much eliminated. And that's by no means an insult. First and foremost, there were many excellent musicians to come out of this movement, including Terry Hill, who moved to New York City while it was happening. So he was on ground zero to see the new wave in New York City and came back and brought that. Started playing in several bands and inspiring a lot of people. The other thing about eliminating the bar for musicianship, the creativity starts exploding. Suddenly you don't have to follow so many rules, you don't have to follow music theory, and so you have a lot more sort of experimental music, you have a lot more types of things that don't necessarily have to sound like anything that's come before. So when that started happening in Knoxville, people started realizing, oh, I can do this. And you don't play traditional venues. A guy named Russ Harper, who incidentally just did a history of punk rock at Mississippi State recently. He teaches there. He's been in so many bands over the years. He's in, I think, is one of the great current Knoxville bands, Evil Twin. He did a history of punk rock at Mississippi, so there is apparently some interest in this. But he started booking shows at Vic and Bill's. Does anybody remember the original Vic and Bill's? Yeah. So it was basically a deli in Fort Sanders, and he starts booking all these bands there, local bands and out-of-town bands like Black Flag. And this is kind of an important thing, right? Important thing to happen because this, kind of like social music, gets reintroduced into Knoxville. The barrier between a performer and an audience is kind of erased a little bit. That's cliche, but it's kind of important when we think about vernacular music and we think about audiences participating within the music. It's not sitting back and letting the sage on the stage or the performer have their say. It's kind of more of a community engagement that way. And so again, even if no one's going to argue, most of these musicians, with a few exceptions, Terry Hill being one. Of course, you all know Todd Steed. He started out as a punk rocker. He plays almost exclusively jazz now, I think, and more experimental things. And so you have venues, you have record stores popping up, you have WOT on air playing this stuff and disseminating it. And I think this kind of music really connects people with audiences, or it connects performer and audience. And honestly, without things like that, I don't think you see something like Big Ears happening in its current form. It might be sort of like the festivals Jack described in the 1800s. You won't see the variety of music and experimental music. And more than what the music is, it's an idea, it's an ethos, it's a philosophy. And so if you have a venue like Pilot Light, I don't know how many of you have been there in the Old City, but it's primarily thought of as a punk rock club, a dive bar. But you go to the website and it has a list of all the bands that played there. Every style of music that's ever existed is occurred there, I promise, even classical. So I just wanted to do a plug for that, and also to mention this music guide, which is great. And by the way, I mentioned to Paul and Jack that I really like the fact that they put the cover of the unknown musician, because it gets the image out there, and we would love to know who this is. We, some theories on it, but if maybe somebody could see this and recognize a relative or someone they knew. While this is the first sort of comprehensive music guide that's existed in Knoxville, I want to mention a book called Cumberland Avenue Revisited, which Jack had an essay in that Jack Renfro put together in 2003. It's an anthology of music, history in Knoxville, coincidentally enough, where Jack stopped, from the 1960s up to the 1990s at that point. It's a fantastic book. You can go to Amazon, find a used copy for $200, or you can go to the Knox County Public Library, Lost McGee Library, check it out, or the McClung Collection, which is where I work, as we've established. And we're non-circulating, but you can sit there and read it. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge and call attention to the fact that so much of this history, we know it and we're able to enjoy it and look at it, the photographs, the music itself, because of libraries and museums and archives. Tennessee Archive of Moving Image and Sound, of course, has a lot of the recordings. Ironically enough, punk rock ends up being one of the best documented periods of music because it coincided with cheap technology, cheap recording technology. You can do home recording, videotape. Rather than spend $10 on a little 3-minute film reel, you can spend $5 on a VHS cassette and a camcorder that's going to record for $5. We also have people that are still here that are great citizens and archivists. Jeff Bills, if you guys know him from the B-Roys, donated a bunch of stuff from that period. Russ Harper himself, we've got some posters from that period. Oh, I forgot to mention, in addition to reporting technology, Xerox machines. Xerox machines had an extremely important effect in disseminating punk rock information in shows, and Kinko's was a major, if we want to talk business's influence on music, I think Kinko's had a more profound influence on that than any one specific venue. I didn't stick the landing, but that's, I kind of wanted to end with a shout out to the archives and libraries, and come visit us if you want to know more about this stuff. Thank you for
The Xerox reminds me of the fact that some of those the earliest mentions of live music in Knoxville saying, look for bills for detail, and they're talking about like what we used to see stapled to poles and that sort of thing. The handbills is how they advertised music in those early days. But Eric mentioned the front cover. Yeah, we have an unknown busker on the front cover. On the back cover is the only statue of Sergei Rachmaninoff in the Western Hemisphere, which is about 1 mile from here. Who has seen the statue? I bet a few people have, but it's a unique thing only in Knoxville, because Sergei Rachmaninoff gave the last concert of his entire career in Knoxville, and a Russian sculptor decided that he wanted to donate his sculpture made in Russia to the last place his idol had performed. And that's why we have a statue of Rachmaninoff, and thanks to people in Bronzed. But it was, but this reminds us that there are a lot of notable endings in Knoxville history. Because of Sergei Rachmaninoff's death, some people who was a famous pianist who wouldn't perform here for many years because he thought Knoxville was cursed because of the Rachmaninoff death. But also the last concerts of I'm trying to think of Chet Atkins was at the Tennessee Theater. The last concert of George Jones was at the Civic Coliseum. A lot of these endings. So I always feel obliged to tell people, please be careful going home. But Hank Williams, of course, is the other story. Hank Williams, that's in the book too. He spent the last night of his life at the A. Johnson Hotel, which is the same hotel where Sergei Rachmaninoff stayed after his final performance as well. But there's a whole lot of interesting lore there. If we're going way over, if there are any questions, I'll be happy to entertain them or comments.